Of all the new weapons used in World War II, few have caught Western imagination more than the kamikaze attacks made on the Allied navies by Japanese suicide squadrons during the spring of 1945. Ever since the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the Japanese had constantly surprised and shocked the Western Allies with their ferocious and utterly determined brand of warfare. Now, in the last great battle of the Pacific, the young warriors of Japan produced their final, deadly encore. Over 2,000 kamikaze pilots met their deaths to defend their emperor. Some Westerners assume that kamikaze is the Japanese word for suicide, but in fact it means divine wind, and the phrase was used in 1945 because it reminded the beleaguered Japanese of the last time that their island fortress had faced a massive foreign invasion, some 700 years before. In 1281, Kublai Khan, ruler of the vast Mongol Empire, tried for the second time in 7 years to conquer Japan. His army of 140,000 Chinese and Mongol veterans landed safely in the southern island of Kyushu and established a beachhead near the modern city of Hakata. But there they were pinned down by a far smaller force of Japanese warriors who launched a stream of suicidal attacks against the invaders. For 2 months they persisted, until, just as the samurai's numbers began to fail, a violent typhoon struck the area. The Mongols' fleet was mostly destroyed at anchor. Many of their troops were killed on the exposed beachhead. The rest struggled home as best they could, leaving the Japanese with the idea that their country was uniquely favored by the gods, who would send another divine wind to save Japan if ever it became necessary. Kublai Khan may have failed to conquer Japan, but he could always console himself with the fact that his empire was the greatest the world had ever known. His conquest of South China during the 1270s had given him direct access to the silks, porcelains, and luxury goods which Europeans and Middle Eastern merchants were willing to travel thousands of miles to acquire. Even more important to Kublai were the taxes he collected in South China, which enabled him to dress in ermine, to build up his military strength, and to fend off all threats to his position as Khan of Khans, the greatest of the Mongol chieftains. But how did the Chinese feel about him? Interestingly enough, although far from enthusiastic about the quality of Mongol rule in general, most Chinese soon adjusted to it and came to see their foreign rulers as the legitimate Chinese dynasty. Admittedly, this feeling was less pronounced in the north of the country, which had suffered terrible devastation during the Mongol conquest of the 1230s. But in the south, the Mongol triumph over the Sung dynasty half a century later caused relatively little economic dislocation, and Chinese ways soon began to reassert themselves in many aspects of cultural, economic, and even political life. In the cultural sphere, for example, men like the 14th century master Ni Zan set styles and standards in Chinese landscape painting which were to dominate Chinese art for centuries to come. Similarly, there were important developments in popular literature. The writing of fiction flourished, and dramatists such as Guan Hangqing produced works which are today recognized as perhaps the finest ever written in China. But although Kublai may have brought a measure of peace and stability to China, he failed to produce a successor. After his death in 1294, rival claimants fought for control of Kublai's throne. Then, during the 1340s and 50s, came floods, droughts, and outbreaks of epidemic disease, which, along with increasing unhappiness with Mongol rule, touched off a series of uprisings against the government. The most serious of these occurred in central and southeastern China, and in 1368, the most powerful of the southern rebels, Zhu Yuanzhang, proclaimed the establishment of a new dynasty, which he called the Ming. From their capital in the great southern city of Nanking, Ming armies drove the Mongols back to the steppe, and within a few years had gained control over the entire country. Zhu Yuanzhang, the first Ming emperor, pictured here in an idealized official portrait, was a pauper who founded an imperial dynasty. Born in the year 1328, Zhu spent 4 decades working his way to the top of the Chinese political world. Along the way, he became a Buddhist monk, a warlord, and the leader of a powerful political movement. As he grew older, however, Zhu became increasingly paranoid about the potential threats to his authority, and as emperor carried out several bloody purges of his former supporters and advisors. This perhaps helps to explain why this unflattering but apparently quite realistic portrait of him is rarely seen. Zhu undoubtedly preferred to be remembered as he is pictured here, a clear-eyed ruler of men who had the interests of his countrymen at heart. After Zhu's death in 1398, there was a succession dispute, and his 4th son usurped the throne to become known as the Yongle Emperor. During his father's lifetime, Yongle had been in charge of Peking, the former Mongol capital in the north. Now he made it the imperial capital, employing 200,000 workmen to build a great city, and within that city a palace complex worthy of the greatest empire on earth. Known as the Forbidden City, this complex is still a breathtaking sight for tourists in Peking today. Yongle was also a formidable military man, and personally led a series of campaigns against the Mongols in an attempt to create a defensive shield against the tribesmen of the steppe. But he failed to capture any of their leaders, and so portions of what we now call the Great Wall were rebuilt and the northern garrisons strengthened. To feed these troops and the residents of his capital, he refurbished and extended the Grand Canal, which now stretched 1,000 miles from Hangzhou to just south of Peking. The Grand Canal is one of the wonders of the world. It now carried some 200,000 tons of grain northwards every year. Perhaps Yongle should have confined his interest to the north of China, but he didn't. And like a later generation of imperialists, he sent several military expeditions against northern Vietnam. He succeeded for a time in annexing it, but his army soon became bogged down in a guerrilla war which proved to be as costly and indecisive for them as the similar wars waged there 5.5 centuries later were for the French and the Americans. Unlike the Americans in our own times, Yongle and his generals did not have to fight their war on television and in the center pages of Life magazine. They didn't have to cope with the profoundly demoralizing effects on the civilians at home of pictures showing the reality of war, like this one, taken by the British war photographer Larry Burrows in Vietnam in 1971. But the horrors of war were just as real then as they are today. In 1427, the Ming pulled out of Vietnam. Finally, imperialist expansion under Yongle also took place by sea. At his command, huge fleets of treasure ships were built at Nanking and sent on a series of 7 voyages to Southeast Asia, India, Ceylon, Arabia, and even the east coast of Africa. Designed to show the Ming flag and advertise Yonglor's position as the world's greatest ruler, these maritime expeditions were colossal in scope. The voyage in 1413 to 15 consisted of 63 or more large vessels and almost 28,000 men. Much though these voyages may have pleased Yonglor's vanity, their cost far exceeded the value of the tribute they brought back. Not long after his death in 1424, like Vietnam, they were abandoned. Before long, virtually all the empire's military resources were being required for defense against the Mongols. In 1449, Yonglor's descendant, Chungdong, was ignominiously captured at a place called Tumu, only a few miles north of the Great Wall, by the Mongol leader Esen. The Mongols now ended the tribute they had paid to the Ming, and instead made a succession of economic and political demands upon the Chinese. When these were not met, raids were launched into Chinese territory, some of which reached the suburbs of Peking. The Chinese responded by renovating and extending the Great Wall until it achieved the impressive dimensions that we see today. Stretching for almost 2,500 miles, it provides eloquent proof of the Ming dynasty's logistical and technological abilities. But for all that, it did not always keep the Mongols out. From this time forward, the dynasty was often on the defensive. The northern frontier was not Ming China's only trouble spot, however. After the ocean voyages ended in the 1430s, coastal defense was neglected, and all overseas trade was banned except under strict government control. The combination proved unworkable, and by 1500, smuggling had become a serious problem in the southeastern provinces of Zhejiang, Fujian, and Guangdong. By 1550, the seas around China were infested by heavily armed bands of smugglers and pirates who terrorized the coastal regions of the country. These men are generally referred to in Chinese sources as Japanese pirates, but most were in fact Chinese seafarers whose livelihoods had been threatened by government policies. For the first time in Chinese history, the southeastern coast had become a frontier of crucial military importance. Some of the pirates, however, really were Japanese, for across the China Sea, important developments were taking place. The Kamakura shogunate had ruled Japan since the 12th century and had successfully organized the nation's defense against Kublai Khan's army in 1281. Now, in the 1330s, it collapsed, the victim of its own outdated policies and the gradual erosion of the old ties of personal loyalty on which the Kamakura feudal system had been based. Its successors, shoguns from the Ashikaga family, never managed to establish effective control over the entire country. Indeed, for much of the period between 1350 and 1550, Japan was racked by local and provincial wars, and the last century of Ashikaga rule is known quite aptly as the time of the Warring States. This remarkable suit of samurai armor survives as a testament to those violent times. By 1500, shogunal authority was at a low ebb, and more power was being exercised by local lords, who were, in effect, absolute rulers in their own domains. By about 1560, some 10 families had formed clan alliances that covered most of Japan and contested for supreme power. Oda in the center, Takeda and Hojo in the north, Otomo and Shimazu to the south. But in many ways, the city of Kyoto was still the most important single place in Japan. Originally built at the end of the 8th century, Kyoto remained the Japanese capital for 1,000 years. It was both the home of the emperor and of the Ashikaga shoguns, and the crucible of Japanese culture. In the Ashikaga period, and for some time before, that culture was heavily influenced by the school of Buddhism known to us in its Japanese form as Zen. Combining as it did an insistence on rigorous self-discipline and the need for self-understanding through meditation rather than textual studies, Zen proved very appealing to the unlettered warriors of the Kamakura and Ashikaga periods. Zen ideas, and particularly Zen aesthetics, also found favor at the imperial and shogunal courts. They were important in the refined rituals of the tea ceremony and in calligraphy and landscape painting. This sublime landscape, painted by the Zen priest Sesshu during the 15th century, is in a style known as habuku, which translates into English as flung ink. Zen Buddhism also left its mark on architecture. This splendid building, known as the Kinkakuji, or Golden Pavilion, was built around the year 1400 by the third Ashikaga shogun, Yoshimitsu. Another Zen-inspired masterpiece from this period is this famous garden, an oasis of peace and harmony near the Golden Pavilion in northwestern Kyoto, Ryoanji. It was built about 1500 in the aftermath of a war which had caused enormous destruction in the city. It's one of the paradoxes of Ashikaga culture that taste and beauty frequently went hand in hand with violence and mayhem. The peak of disruption in the pattern of Japanese life coincided with the arrival of the first European visitors to Japan in the mid-16th century. They brought with them Christianity, preached by missionaries like St. Francis Xavier. The Europeans also showed the Japanese how to use firearms, which made it necessary to build massive fortifications of stone, very like those in use in Europe. Over 200 castles with bastions, citadels, and moats were built. Osaka Castle, pictured here, was originally built in the late 16th century. It was subsequently destroyed several times, but this modern reconstruction of one of its buildings gives some impression of its former grandeur. By 1600, the age of warfare in Japan came to an end, thanks to the work of three remarkable unifiers. In 1568, Nobunaga, leader of the Oda clan, captured Kyoto, the imperial capital. In 1573, he deposed the last Ashikaga shogun. By the time he was assassinated by a jealous rival in 1582, he had forced almost all the other lords to accept his orders. Within a year, his ablest general, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, had consolidated Nobunaga's work, reorganizing the tax system and redistributing the land to provide sufficient funds for his ambitious policies. There is a Japanese saying, Nobunaga made the loaf, Hideyoshi baked it, but Ieyasu ate it, because it was another of Nobunaga's generals, Tokugawa Ieyasu, who in 1603 established the dynasty of shoguns that was to give Japan peace until the 19th century. Shielded from but not ignorant of the outside world, Tokugawa Japan prospered. Between 1600 and 1850, the land under cultivation doubled, its population trebled, and peasant income quadrupled. There was peace in all the islands for 2.5 centuries, an unparalleled achievement in any advanced society. If increased population meant prosperity for Japan, it created some problems in China. In 1393, the first Ming emperor ruled over some 60 million subjects. By 1580, the total had more than doubled to perhaps 130 million. To meet the increased demand for food, more and more land was brought under cultivation, and new crops began to change the agricultural balance. Sweet potatoes, maize, and tobacco were introduced from the New World. To clothe the multitudes, cotton, which had been grown under the Mongol rule, was widely cultivated in the Yangtze Delta and other parts of China. And for export, Chinese craftsmen produced luxury goods, like this jade figure of a monkey with its young. But above all, they produced silk and the blue and white Ming porcelain that's been a collector's item ever since. But while these treasures were being produced by the craftsmen, many other Chinese experienced severe economic problems. The years after 1550 saw a deterioration in the climatic conditions, with harvest failures, droughts, and famines. There were also several outbreaks of epidemic diseases. At the same time, Ming China faced new and increasingly serious military problems. In 1592 and again in 1597, the Japanese invaded Korea, sacking its capital Seoul and seemingly moving towards an invasion of China. The Koreans appealed to Peking for aid, and a major Chinese army duly arrived and drove back the invaders. For some years they remained, lest the Japanese should return. But their victory was illusory. Firstly, it was expensive, and the extra taxes in China to pay for the army caused a rash of riots in many major cities. Secondly, it diverted much-needed troops from the northeastern frontier, where a new power was emerging among the tribesmen of the forest and the steppe, the Manchus. The Manchus attacked Korea in 1606. In 1618, they invaded Chinese-held territory northeast of the Great Wall. In 1621, they captured Shenyang, or Mukden, and soon made it their capital. Ming China was unable to oppose these incursions effectively because of a spate of urban riots, army mutinies, and peasant revolts. Finally, in April 1644, a rebel leader called Li Zecheng reached Peking. As his forces closed in on the Forbidden City, the last Ming emperor hanged himself. Then, before he could establish his own dynasty, Li himself was driven out by the Manchus. Within a few years, the Manchus held virtually the whole empire in their control. Once again, as during the Mongol period, China was completely ruled by foreigners, and it was to stay that way until 1911. A new age in East Asian history had begun.